So welcome, good writers and good thinkers in EDU 540. Oh my gosh, such great work is getting done. And I really appreciate all your efforts and everything you're doing in the course. And I hope as I read, you're getting something out of the various activities and things that I've planned and that you're developing as the course goes on. So welcome to week 11. And this week is a particularly, I want to say, complex week because narrative writing is a very, very complex and complicated process, or at least it can be because it has a number of different component parts. So unlike exposition or unlike personal writing, where we're developing some ideas, but we're doing it in a fairly straightforward way, narrative writing has a lot of twists and turns, and developing those different component parts that are part of those twists and turns can be quite challenging for us as writers and can certainly be challenging for students whom we're teaching writing. The upshot, though, and the wonderful part of it is that it's, I think, incredible fun. Narrative writing, because it encompasses so much and it's so valuable and so intrinsic to the human experience, because it really has to do with storytelling and making meaning of the world, not just ourselves and our own experiences. That making meaning of the world can make storytelling incredibly powerful. So this week, I kind of bring together those ideas of narration, storytelling, and fiction. All that encompasses the same basic principles and the same basic components, as we'll see in just a moment. But all of that really makes us human, and being able to compose narratives in some very special ways advances our understanding not only of ourselves but of other people and of how the world works. So narrative writing can be very, very important, powerful, and that making meaning that telling stories allows us to do makes us and helps us grow as human beings. So let's get to it and let's talk about this whole narrative writing thing. So here we are, narrative writing, EDU 540. This is EDU 540, right? So, as we learned from Tompkins this week, parts of a narrative include point of view, setting, characters, plot, and theme. And these components require decisions being made on the part of writers who are developing stories and developing narratives. So let's take a look at these separately and individually. Tompkins talks about point of view as really coming in four different patterns, in four different ways of development. And really, technically, there are more. These are four good patterns of point of view to look at and isolate for your students and talk about in their decision making. They can make choices about which point of view they want to cast their stories in. So there's obviously a first person point of view. We've experimented a little bit with this in our biographies and our autobiographies and our personal writing, but first person point of view in narrative is really fictional. It's made up. So we're writing and thinking as if it's an I, but we're telling a story that we're developing from our imaginations. So it's using that I pronoun. Omniscient viewpoint is the narrator, whoever that is, knows everything about everybody, knows who they are, knows their characters, but also importantly knows their thoughts. So in an omniscient point of view, we gather what all the different characters are thinking, as well as what they're doing. So that interplay can create a really complex and rich fabric out of which we're developing some meaning and some sort of theme. Limited omniscient allows us to see what characters are thinking through things like dialogue and monologue. So, and select characters, not necessarily every character. So it might be two characters in a story, but we know what they're thinking, and yet what they're saying might not be what they're thinking. So again, we're creating some tension and some conflict, which we'll also see as an important part of developing narrative and for storytelling, and an objective point of view from that he, she, it perspective. We don't really learn about what characters are thinking, but we do learn about how they're interacting with one another, how they're connecting, and we watch them and generate meaning out of what we're seeing them do and hearing them say. And that's Spalding in the background. I've got to keep going. Setting is the next isolated component that we can have our students think about and work on. And setting is really important because it can set the mood of a story. So, how we design and develop our setting really contributes to what the mood of our stories can be like: happy, sad, um, uh, you know, um, angry. We can setting can help develop those ideas. So we want to look at location. What's the weather like? What's the time and the time period like? What's nice about setting, as Tompkins points out, is that we can often research settings and look more deeply into the time frame and the time period that we're creating, into the location that we're dealing with. So, for example, I've been working for several years on a narrative that takes place on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1924. And I'm looking at illustrations and I'm reading other stories and I'm seeing what this time was like. A great example of setting is the first page, the first description in the book of Mice and Men, which sets a mood. In fact, it sets up the conflict for the entire book, and Steinbeck does it in just a short amount of time. And really gives us a sense of what that story is like, and what some of the conflicts are going to be like in the story, just through setting. So setting can be really a very valuable element to focus on and elaborate with, for ourselves and with our students. Characters is where narrative gets fun, because here we can operate with people and manipulate and change around relationships and different interactions that we're developing throughout the story. So we can describe our characters in a certain way. Are they consistent with how they look, or are they inconsistent with how they look? So again, we can create all those different kinds of tensions in the story just from how we describe characters. And of course, our characters act, they speak, and in some cases, they think in the stories as well. And we can develop motivation, we can develop reactions and response for different characters. And again, out of our imagination, create a whole world with people, some of whom we may have known, and some of the qualities of which we may have known, but we're applying those in an imaginative context. Finally, there's the idea of plot. And when you look this week at our Sports Night video, episode 23, you'll see how plot can work in all sorts of different ways with different characters. So, of course, plot, we know, has a beginning, middle, and an end. Sometimes we hear the end before we hear the beginning, or before we hear the middle. So we can juxtapose and kind of change around the order of that beginning, middle, and an end, but we recognize that that's the flow of a life. That's the flow of a narrative and a story going forward. And of course, in plot, we're developing conflict. And out of this conflict is often where we develop our theme and our theme for the story. So Tompkins goes through 4 different types of conflict: character and nature, character and society, conflict between characters, and finally conflict within characters. So any and all of these can be connected in a plot in different ways, again, to express a theme, and thinking about the intricacies and how we're going to develop that plot and create our theme can be a really valuable exercise for students to do, as well as for us as writers. Kind of organize that a little bit ahead of time, maybe plot things ahead of time. So maybe some of you are familiar with the plot diagram, the rising action, the climax at the very top, and the denouement, the resolution that takes place at the end, where the characters come to terms with what they've done and what they've said during the story. I really want to recommend the movie Michael Clayton, with my man crush George Clooney involved as the lead actor in that particular movie, because the resolution, the denouement, takes its maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and nothing is said. All you're doing is watching George Clooney drive away in a car, and there's an incredible sense of resolution to all that's happened in the story. It's really a wonderful example of how plot can work. And finally, we have the idea of theme. So, theme can come about in different ways. We can plot the theme ahead of time. So, this is what we want to communicate, and this is what we want to make clear to our readers about the meaning of the story. And we can think about that and develop it ahead of time. Or we can let the theme evolve as we're writing, as we're imagining the world and the characters, the setting, etc., that we're creating. We're also developing a theme. We can make meaning out of what's going on and then discover it as we're writing, which is another incredibly cool thing about narrative writing. So some of the questions that we may want to ask our students and ask ourselves is, what is the meaning? How can we induce, right? Use inductive reasoning to take the different details that we have from plot, from character, from setting, and then assemble some sort of theme. What did the author mean to communicate? That's something we overlook. Often we'll say to our students, the theme can be anything that you think. That's not always true. As writers, you know yourselves that you're trying to communicate a particular point. You certainly did that in your personal writing, your biographic writing, your descriptive writing. You were communicating an essence. That's the important thing to get to in a piece of writing, because an author doesn't put pen to paper or hand to keyboard without thinking about affecting a reader and creating an impact for the reader. And good writers do that deliberately with forethought and some recognition of how the patterns and the details that they're developing are going to build into a point that they want to make. So theme is not always anything you want. Doesn't quite work that way. The author, remember, is communicating to an audience. And finally, we can ask our students and ask ourselves, how does that narrative make us feel? What does that narrative make us think about? Because those can often be keys to theme as well. And finally, one of the reasons that I've been a little bit late in composing everything and getting everything together is that on April 12th at 4:45 in the afternoon, this little guy was born, my grandson, and the story has just begun for him. So this was quite an incredible event, and it's a story to tell. And certainly Alexander, like all of us, will have stories to tell, stories to build on, and stories to contribute overall to the world. All righty. So we're going to leave it there. Ha ha, chuckling grandfather. So it's so good. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for looking in. I appreciate all of you who bother to look at these mini lessons every week. They're a lot of fun to do. And this week in particular, because it's narrative and because the story of Alexander is included, I'm really enjoying thinking about working on writing, and I'm really enjoy narrative. And I'm really looking forward to see the kinds of contributions that you can make this week. Keep writing, keep thinking. You're doing a great job. I look forward to seeing you soon. In person during our in-person conferences. Keep working on your artifacts and developing your writing portfolio. And finally, all the best. Take care.